Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and today I am joined by Guy Williams.
Hey, Jim, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for coming on the show today.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad I finally got to be here.
Yay. So today we're going to be talking about the future of spirituality.
It's an interesting conversation.
I think it will be.
I think
so. Just before that, you brought along a special guest.
I did. So one of the things at our center that I'm very proud of is that we have a great music department, and one of our artists is Paul Calabro.
Okay.
And he'll be blessing us with his music.
All right. Well, Paul, take it away.
Gratitude lifts my soul in the nights that come and go. The stars shine brightly. They tell me that I'm immersed in an infinite sea of beauty and truth and all possibility. How beautiful it is to be here with you whenever we sit discovering the truth. My mind flows like a river. It runs through my body and opens low inside me. Every day is like a spark of a flame. It's an infinite sea of possibility. Perfect soul, you know I can't let it go. It moves through me, making me whole. Solitude, yeah, lifts my soul in the nights that come and go. The stars shine brightly. They tell me that I'm immersed in an infinite sea of beauty and truth and all possibility. Every day is like a spark of a flame. It's an infinite sea of possibility. Perfect soul, you know I can't let go. It moves through me, making me whole. Every day is like a spark of a flame. It's an infinite sea of possibility. Perfect soul, you know I can't let go. It moves through me, making me whole. So that song's called Spark of a Flame, and it basically was about the transcendence between nature and the consciousness of humanity. And so I was very inspired once just by, looking up at the night sky, seeing the tapestry of the stars. And so that's where this song was inspired from.
Well, that was just great. Thank you so much for bringing Paul with you
Oh,
today.
well, thank you, Paul. Yeah.
Yes. So I thought we'd start the conversation because we both are coming from fairly outside of standard traditional religious perspectives. And so maybe we should start with kind of where we're at a little bit and what we see as the challenge. And I'll just kind of kick us off here. My background, how I understand myself at the moment, would be as a philosophical naturalist. And at a basic level, naturalism as a philosophy is saying that basically all that there is the natural. There is no supernatural. So here's the thing. When I'm thinking about the kind of the state that affairs are in at the moment, from the naturalist perspective, we would start with the position that the world or universe is knowable. And by that, what we mean is that there are patterns that can be discovered that can help us understand how to better master our world. And this is something that's kind of baked into how humans have thought about things from the earliest days. It's how we try to pay attention to things to figure out how we can better, again, master our environment and what we're doing. So from that, then, we end up with a problem. Because if the world is knowable, and if it is patterns that can be deduced, then that means that the world is not magical. Now, by magical, we could mean, that we're filled with wonder or awe, and that's one thing. But magical in the more of an actual sense of there's a reason why things happen. There isn't like these, at least from the naturalist perspective, there wouldn't be these kind of miraculous things happening. So from there, it becomes a bit of a challenge, because if there's not the miraculous, if there isn't the magical, that means that there's not the angels, that there's not the demons. And along with that goes the question of meaning in the world. Because if it's all just kind of come about through these natural processes, these patterns that are happening, then at the end of the day, it's hard to say what actually counts as meaning. Now, for a lot of people, because we have embraced this scientific worldview that's helped us to perceive in a way that our ancestors never would have imagined in terms of what we've come to know about the world, we are wrestling with this challenge that the world is meaningless. And people aren't necessarily wanting to accept that or let go of past positions because of that concept, but at the same time, because of our scientific understanding about things, it's created a real struggle for us. We're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this is where I see the question about the future of spirituality is, what does that look like going forward? Now that we've kind of peeked behind the curtain, we can't go back to pretending like we believe in things that we now understand differently. And so that's kind of where I see the current struggle or the challenge that's before us.
Mm-hmm.
How are you seeing things?
Oh my, that's a lot to unpack. So I'm an ordained New Thought minister. So okay. I come from a background of faith, but I don't come from a traditional background. In fact, I would start with probably a 12th century mystic by the name of Meister Eckhart, who says that in time, our greatest obstacle to God is our belief in God. And so, we'll have language differences probably, but I would start with that perhaps one of the things that is happening is that the idea of God that we hold is way too small for the consciousness that we're evolving into. And I think that it's important for a person of faith, whatever that may be. I don't want to define what that would look like for an individual, but I think that for a person of faith or a person who is living in the world, that we should have a certain level of scientific literacy. And what I mean by science is that body of knowledge that can be known, that is knowable, that is universal, that it can be known anywhere, that it can be demonstrated, and that it can be replicated. So there's a whole body of knowledge that is there. And what we also know is that science is incomplete. Just, when I think of something like the whole story of creation, starting with the Big Bang, or the creation stories, or the Kabbalistic experiences of that, they're all languaging something, but all of them get to a point of something called in Kabbalah Ein Sof, that which cannot be known. In science, it would be called the singularity. That's that place where the laws of physics no longer apply. So there's something about the whole beginning of things that cannot be known. And it doesn't mean that science isn't wrong, but I think that there are some things that are not. So that leaves us into this other area. And you and I both are fans of a man by the name of Abraham Heschel, who says, that there are two ways of knowing. There's reason and there's wonder. And so what I would look at as the spiritual path is more the path of wonder and awe. And it's not that it invalidates science, but it takes up where perhaps science could be left off.
Gotcha.
So that'd be my opening thought.
Yes.
And then, this idea of meaning, I think, first of all, I would begin again with saying that, we live in a very old universe that has a very long future ahead of it. It is as John Hott says, it's a cosmic story that's still being told, and we are in a flux, and so it's an interesting question: where is spirituality headed? And I think first of all, maybe there's some definitions. What is spirituality? What is religion? What is God? What are we even talking about there?
Right.
And because sometimes before we can answer the question, we have to kind of know what the question is.
Yeah.
So I think that we're in a period where, as Meister Eckhart says, the God that had been there for us is too small to contain the evolutionary moment that we're in. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question real quick before we get too far past it. You started off by mentioning that you're a New Thought minister. What is New Thought?
So New Thought is so we grow out of, probably the easiest way to say what New Thought is it's applied transcendentalism.
Oh.
We grow out of the American Transcendentalist movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa May Alcott, Henry David Thoreau. It is a body of beliefs. We began philosophically. How would I say who we are? So we grew out of the American Transcendentalists. We grew from a group of very interesting radical individuals in the late 19th century: suffragists, women, people of color, people of gender differences, abolitionists, artists, writers, radicals, socialists. So they were people who were not satisfied with traditional religious cultures, nor were they satisfied with traditional Christian teachings. So they were more expansive. They began looking at other philosophies and other religious traditions. The particular denomination I grew out of was originally called the Science of Mind and Spirit. It was founded back in the 1920s by a man by the name of Ernest Holmes. We are since now called Centers for Spiritual Living. So we have been around about 100 years.
Okay.
And we're global.
Nice.
Not big, but global.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are in a very interesting time where there seems to be a lot of shifting and questioning and looking at things differently, maybe more so than has happened in quite a while, with kind of shifting tides on things. But you brought up a good question too about some definitions on things, and one of the ones you said was spirituality. I know for a lot of people, as a naturalist, they wonder, well, how can you talk about spirituality? And I'll just offer my 2 cents of how I look at this, and you can let me know your thoughts on there. But for me, when we think of the word spirit, it ultimately is coming from the word for breath, and it ties into this idea about life, right? So for me, spirituality has to do with things that are concerned about life. And then even beyond that, and this is probably some areas where we have some things in common, I would understand a spiritual life or a spiritual person to be someone who's engaged in practices that help to shape and form who they are desiring to be within the world, and especially as they relate to the experience of life and wonder and awe. How are you understanding the word spiritual?
I would say the same thing, and I would maybe even make it even more basic.
Okay.
That our spirituality is our habits.
Okay.
Because our habits begin to define us. And they begin to offer the lens, the perspective, the prejudice by which we appreciate the external world.
Right.
So they are habits that develop the interior world, so that we can perceive the exterior world at a place of amazement, of wonder, of the transcendent.
I like that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to explore a little bit more of this idea where you're saying that there's a place where science leaves off. What is that space exactly, and how do you see that kind of relationship between science and whatever this space is?
So I think science has the potential to continue to expand. So I don't think that it hits a wall and ends.
Okay.
But it has to meet a criteria, and what I mean by that is can it be known by anybody? Is it universally known?
Okay.
Can it be demonstrated?
Consensually verifiable information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and there are certain things like God that don't fit that criteria, and so you may have a lot of scientists, good scientists, who postulate ideas about God, and they may be right and they may be wrong. But it's not science; it's opinion,
Yes.
and so there are certain things that science, by its nature, cannot answer. And that doesn't mean, and I think what has happened since living in a post-enlightenment world is that we have come to this idea that says that unless it's verifiable, it can't be true. But you and I live in a world where there are plenty of things that aren't verifiable but are true, like love, like caring, like wonder, and they happen, the sublime. And it's not that they're true or untrue by the words of science. It's just that's not the parameters of where science is.
Or I think sometimes too what happens is the way that science would talk about emotions and feelings is not a way that they necessarily care for. Because when you start talking about chemical and electrical responses in the brain that are bringing about these sensations, that can feel dry, or it can feel like that we're at the mercy of, a progression of a chain of events, and brings up questions about things like free will. But there's definitely ways that science would talk about those things.
And I think for some people, it can even be frightening.
Sure.
Because is if I am my biology,
Right.
then where's God, or that idea of God.
Yes.
And so again, as we think in terms of a spirituality that is relevant for the future, it has to be a spirituality that encompasses science. It can't deny it. It can't invalidate it. It has to embrace it. And in many ways, the only, we've talked about this, the only way that you can really know something is to language it. And science gives us a technology of understanding. And there's nothing to fear with what we get to know.
Well, that's the thing I would come back with too, is that at the end of the day, truth has nothing to fear from open, honest investigation.
Right.
So part of what I think is interesting when we're talking about these different approaches and thinking about the future and embracing science, I think in a lot of ways we can see that the scientific worldview has really kind of won the day in many respects, because you'll even see within different religious traditions their attempt to validate their position by demonstrating how it fits with science.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing so, they're basically conceding to the fact that that's kind of where we're at as far as how people are seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do have to embrace that. To me, I think for a lot of people, and bring up the God question is it still believable?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that's why a lot of the traditional stuff has been in decline, is because the claims they're making are harder and harder for more of a scientifically literate community to embrace.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the challenge, like on the naturalism side, is what does that spirituality look like if we're not acknowledging a supernatural?
I think it's a spirituality on life support. Because I think you're right, and I think that that's probably more true in the West than it is in the East.
Okay.
Because I think that if we look in terms of Eastern religious or spiritual traditions, they're open to science. Particularly, I'm thinking in terms of Buddhism. It's a non-issue, and at one point in what the Western spiritual traditions, science and spirituality worked together conjunctively for a same way of knowing. It was called philosophy. And the split was really more about politics than it was about wisdom or knowing. And I think we still see that today. So when you have a spiritual tradition that says that you have to sort of bend the laws of physics to conform to their metaphysics, it's a metaphysics that can't be tenable. It's not a sustainable thing because it's not built on anything that can continue to expand or grow.
So how do you? Well, I don't want to put you so much on the spot necessarily, but because I think we're in a similar space but slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So in the place where we're still using language that's talking about God or things that are, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if we're looking at what we do understand at this point in terms of like physics and the challenge of something like divine intervention, in terms of like how would we explain that? How would we explain that from a scientific perspective? There doesn't appear to be space for something like that. So how do you respond to the scientific position with something like that?
So first of all, I think that it's not an either or.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is a person can live a life of spiritual activism and not subscribe to divine intervention.
Okay.
Or where that would be. Somebody that has been a guiding light for me was a Jesuit mystic in the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. He was a scientist, he was a geologist, he was a scientist, he was a priest, he was a mystic, a man by the name of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he began to, he sat with that whole thing of where is the divine in matter? And what does that mean? And it's not so much that God itself bends the laws of physics, because even St. Paul says, that God cannot act against its own nature.
Okay.
And the nature of the divine, however or whatever what calls that, is a life-affirming nature. And it's a nature that deals with love. And love can only be offered, it can never be imposed. So there has to be a level of freedom in that. So there are certain things that God can't do.
Okay.
And that doesn't make God any less than God, whatever that term or that idea is. But and that's something that this guy Thomas Ord is talking a lot about these days. And is God omnipotent? Well, if God was omnipotent, then it would be against the nature of what God is. And I don't want to get too far on that, but for the sake of our conversation, divine intervention, perhaps not, but inspiration, perhaps. And what Teilhard would say is that God, metaphorically speaking, is a little in the future and is luring us, is attracting us, is drawing us. And it's not so much that God prevents scary things from happening to us, but there's a presence in the scary thing or in the experience of the scary thing. Yeah.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's interesting ways that I think that we can also personify things in order to help to understand them better, because just the limits of human minds and our imagination, sometimes we find it easier to talk about things in a certain way that become metaphorical or parabolic, and that can be very helpful, and maybe sometimes the metaphor or the parable gets taken literally when it wasn't intended to, which can lead to some interesting questions. But it is interesting, how do we talk about our experience of life? Because it is so awe, wonder, mystery. As much as we have learned from science, there's so much that we still do not know, right? But how do we engage that? And from a naturalist perspective, this idea of transcendence is still very important in terms of human psyche. What we've come to understand about what it takes for humans to flourish and what's necessary for us to be complete. And so it's interesting that even within naturalistic perspectives, there's this idea of transcendence or elation that can be experienced even without the supernatural part of it, which makes for some interesting ways of exploring spirituality from that direction as well.
So I think there, when you were talking, I had this thought of this, something that is attributed to the Buddha, where he says, "Don't seek truth, seek your prejudices." Meaning, instead of trying to think that there's this universal truth that you're seeking, look at how you perceive things, and in the understanding that in a conversation between you and I, we have different perceptions of how things may be, and we're going to language those things differently, and that doesn't make one person right or the other person wrong. That's where our prejudice comes in, because we have this need to be right, because it helps us sleep at night, But what if I can be curious,
right,
and be in a conversation without it threatening my experience, so that we can have a conversation about atheism, we can have a conversation about naturalism, we can have a conversation about mysticism, and remain curious in the conversation without having to proselytize a point of view or a prejudice.
Yes.
And I think that is. I think, when we, and again, bringing this back to this idea of a future of spirituality, hopefully it is a practice of curiosity, and it's a practice of self-awareness of when I am imposing my prejudice as a lens on how I see things.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things we've tried to cultivate at Kinship Cafe is a safe place to talk about anything.
Right.
Right. And so, and that idea of having that curiosity, is so important, that we can be comfortable with what we know and still be curious. It's not going to hurt us to find out.
Right. Right. And if someone thinks differently than us, that's all that is isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Wow.
And that can lead to some fruitful discussions on trying to understand, how did they get there, right? One of the things that earlier you're talking about, kind of our need to be right. There's, I think, kind of inherently we kind of operate from this place of naive realism, that whatever I see and perceive and understand is reality, and if anybody sees it different, there's something wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And when we get to that place of humility, where we start to realize how I'm seeing things is really strongly influenced by the whole rest of my life behind me, right? And the more I can be aware of that, then I can have more compassion, more space to hear and understand from somebody else's perspective.
In New Thought, there's a cliche term that people use a lot, which is, "This is my truth." And it's one of those things that sort of rackles me because truth, in order to be truth, by the very nature of being truth, has to be universal. And if it's not universal, it's not truth, it's an opinion. And that's okay, as long as I recognize, I'm not listening to you saying, is he speaking true or not? I'm listening to you, and how I'm responding or reacting to you has more to do with my internal conversation than it has anything to do with your conversation. And it's just an opportunity for me to look at what my prejudice is, my opinion is, and how I'm layering that onto my experience of reality.
And this is where spiritual practices of things like mindfulness are so powerful, because it helps us to become more aware of what am I actually feeling at this moment? How am I interpreting what that person is saying or what they did? And is that just because of what they've done, or am I bringing stuff to this? Right? And so just developing those practices of being more aware and being able to see when we're bringing that external information to bear on something is so huge in helping us to get past some of these things that are so hard.
Right.
Our political situation right now is just so unbelievable in terms of how just like everybody is, right? There's no talking. It's just like this stalemate. And finding ways to help develop that curiosity and that willingness to hear each other, I think, is just some stuff that's so desperately needed today.
There was a teaching from Jesus where he says to pray for your enemies, because where New Thought comes from, something that Dr. Holmes says is that when we pray, we're not changing God, we're changing ourselves, and it's an activity in mind. And so it's that, when you think in terms of the political system, how angry we get at somebody else, and can we love them? Can we desire their good? There's the Buddhist metta prayer. May this person be filled with loving kindness. May they be well. May they be peaceful and at ease, and may they be happy. And as a practice, to find the one you're having the issue with the most, and be willing to desire their happiness, or to ask yourself, why don't I want them to have it? And that's the interesting thing.
I think so much of our inability to be open and curious is that fear, right? And so trying to address who we perceive as our enemy or somebody that we have strong disagreements with, and practice that loving kindness, it really changes things. I mean, if you really take it upon yourself to work through that process, it can't help but shift how you look at them.
And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at, the failure of religion in culture today, because it has carried over a colonial mindset that wants to impose something on someone else. So it's immediately made them wrong, or it's immediately made them less than. And there's no conversation there. There's just simply one's right, one's wrong, one's in, one's out. And when one is out or wrong, then the person who is right feels that they have certain privileges to the other one that doesn't. We make them less than, and that's not a spirituality that's going to take us into the future. It's the road to predation.
Well, and it's, you talk about the other, right? How that in-group, out-group thing is happening. So much of religion or different traditions is about the need for some kind of salvation, which means it's always on the lookout for what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And because if things are going well,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, but what if you take that off the table?
Yeah.
Something that Dr. Holmes used to say is he said, "If your soul was lost, I wouldn't know where to go looking for it." And but there are plenty of spiritual traditions where salvation is a non-issue,
right.
and to take that fear out, that level of obedience out. Yeah, it's dangerous from a political point of view because all of a sudden people get to think freely. Brian McLaren wrote a book called The Great Spiritual Migration, where he addresses, where things are going, and he says, one of the things that's standing in the way in spiritual centers are beliefs, because beliefs are what creeds are what separate us. You believe it or you don't believe it. You're in or you're out. And what he says is that we should begin looking at our spiritual centers not so much grounded on a creed or a belief, but to say that we are schools of love, and that our curriculum is how to love. And,
there you go.
And because salvation, what I don't even know what that begins to even mean, or atonement, or these concepts that impose something on another. I grew up Roman Catholic, and I remember struggling with my own mind and my desire to explore things, and literally thinking that my eternal soul was in jeopardy if I was to go that far. Oh my goodness gracious, what a restrictive thing to impose on somebody. And I certainly can't imagine any kind of loving, intelligent presence imposing that on somebody else. That's something that was created by somebody who probably needed therapy.
Well, I mean, there's obviously a long tradition with Christianity.
Yeah.
And a lot of different ways that it's been interpreted and used over the centuries, and some better than others.
Mm-hmm.
But there is at its core this idea that there's a serious problem at the moment that we need to be rescued from. Which, in my experience, which I also came out of a Christian background, is that it was always looking to exploit in a certain way the negativity, that things are not getting better, that the only way out of this is by divine intervention. And for me, the more I came to understand, just how much we've actually progressed, that in almost every area that you could measure, whether you're talking about violence, war, women's rights, education, poverty, hunger, birth rates in terms of survivability and that kind of thing, everything's just gotten astronomically better.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that sometimes within our limited perspective, getting back to that thing again, there's ups and downs, right? That can appear like, astronomical, but it's only our small perception. When we see the bigger picture, it's a big old giant trend going upwards.
It is. Something that Teilhard talks about again is that, and for me, I guess I would say that it would be a component of a future-oriented spirituality is evolution. Evolution is fits and starts. It's messy. It's up. It's down. It learns as it goes.
Yeah.
It's not predetermined, and that is what we're in the experience of. It's not even finished, not even close to finished. Like I said earlier, we have a long future ahead of us, one way or the other, or the cosmos does, and so what if it isn't broken, but what if it's incomplete? and what if it is moving towards? And I think that I think spirituality has an important role, whatever that is. And I'm not saying one or the other, but this practice of mindfulness, this practice of becoming aware of what we're aware of, I think it has an important role because I think that the great spiritual teachers have been evolutionary events that have taught us things like rightness and justice, and
Yeah.
and I think that those are radically incredible moments, and we're not
Yeah.
done.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a progression that you can see, especially if you study world religions and going back, into the prehistoric period forward. There's definitely an evolution of thought, right? The other thing, when we're thinking about, the broader perspective that doesn't necessarily see that the sky is falling everywhere you look, is what if, to use your language, we worked from the position of our strengths? Because there are real challenges. There are real issues that have to be faced. But if we saw how we've been able to progress and work from that position in terms of how do we tackle these new challenges, how much more effective might we be rather than just, wringing our hands because, the sky's falling and nobody can do anything about it?
I think it's imperative. So, and I would offer two things. One of the main tenets of New Thought, of which is the tradition that I'm part of, is that thoughts are causative. That there's a power in thought, that it influences and directs things. So with that idea, I would also offer one of my favorite books years ago was a man by the name of Robert Sardillo, and he was a psychologist. And he wrote a book called Freeing the Soul from Fear. But one of the things that he suggests in the book is that when we experience fear and trauma, that we go biologically into a survival mode. And as a result of that, how we process information becomes very limited.
Yep.
And what flatlines is the imagination. And if there is a fund of divinity in us, it is our imagination. And if the imagination has been stymied or flatlined, and if thoughts are causative, then our ability to create new possibilities has been limited. And I think in terms of that, just kind of growing up as a child of the 60s, when I would look at science fiction, and I grew up with Star Trek and all of that, there was a level of optimism. The music, the art, there was a level of optimism. Now there's a strong dystopian image of how things are, because I think there is a global anxiety, a global fear, and rightly so. I mean, things like climate change are real, and we're not going to get rid of them by thinking happy thoughts. But we're not going to solve them by living in fear. So there would be other things to look at.
Yeah.
Like hope, like imagination, like thinking in terms of possibility. Because that just, from a neuroscientific point of view, it begins to open up real estate in our mind.
Absolutely.
And turning on lights that heretofore are darkened.
Yes.
Yeah.
And getting back to the political kind of stalemate thing, when we go into attack mode or we feel like we need to be defensive, similar thing happens where that creative part, that reasoning part of the brain shuts down.
So another thing that is going on in the culture that we live today, and this is whether you are watching the right or you are watching the left, whatever your political, because basically they're doing the same thing. They are both producing outrage. And outrage, righteous outrage, we're right, they're wrong. It gives us a nice shot of dopamine. We
Yeah.
love it,
Yeah.
and it's highly addictive, and so we are a culture of junkies on dopamine, and continually getting outraged, and we have to look. It's a gateway drug. We have to look for more things to be outraged about, and as a result, yeah, then other areas of our brain are not working anymore. It kind of shrinks the mind,
Yeah.
and is easily manipulated and directed.
So we're back to that sense of epistemological humility.
Love that.
I don't know everything.
Right.
Right? And developing that curiosity. What can I learn about this other person? Why did they hold that position? How did they get there? And not feel threatened that I'm going to be, contaminated simply by hearing about it. Is the things that we need to be cultivating as we're moving forward in what we might call our spiritual journey.
Yeah, and being comfortable with doubt. Because I think it was Paul Tillich who talks about, he says, we are a finite mind that's trying to grapple with infinite concepts. And so our faith, whatever we call that, should always be re-examined and reassessed and realigned.
Yeah.
What worked before, but it may not work today. And so to be open to that and to say, it's okay if I get threatened. It's okay if my concept of the universe is being challenged. There's nothing to worry about there. Again, maybe my idea of God is way too small, or my idea of science is way too small, or whatever. Can I be curious? Can I be open? Or as Jesus would say, can I be as a little child?
I guess that Roman Catholic stuff rubbed off on you.
Oh, it's in the DNA.
Well, and it's really part of our culture too.
It
Right?
is.
I mean,
it is. Yeah.
But I think, there's. It's not necessarily something where we're looking at wholesale abandonment of things either. I think there's ways that religious thought has evolved even within their religious traditions, right? So like within the Christian tradition, looking at how things evolved from Old Testament into the New Testament, and even subsequently. So, thinking about, the rights of women or the abolition of slavery. These are things that were not really, you see trajectories you could see potentially in, where the books were pointing to, but they never got there. These are things that have happened subsequently that many religious people would feel it would be against God to do something like have slaves. So I think that, or getting back to the question where you're talking about some of the political stuff, like with, what was happening with the scientific revolution and the idea about the Earth not being the center of everything. We survived that. We survived, that we're in a solar-centric solar system, right? That even itself is not the center, but is revolving around something larger in this galaxy, which is only one of, how many?
We don't even know.
And so if we can evolve through those things, maybe we can continue and find ways to bring the things that make sense forward. Because I think in many of the traditions, they do have fascinating power in terms of developing compassion, of developing, a concern maybe for the marginalized, for that idea of like social justice. How do we work it with the rest of the stuff we're learning, And I like the fact that you brought up that there's been ways even within the Christian tradition to practice the faith without the expectation that there's this idea of divine intervention. So, there's maybe some tools or resources we can look at for what does the future look like.
Right. Yeah. And I think in terms of the prophet Meshach, what does this divine experience, what does it yearn for in us? To do justice, to practice kindness, and humble, which I think, humble is humility as a shield. It allows us to grow. And that's an ancient wisdom that we continue to relook at, and it can be a guiding light into the future.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very fascinating discussion.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
I have too. But before we wrap things up, we've got to get Paul back for one more song.
I hope so.
Okay.
Good.
Found himself in the night. What he saw through his eyes, the whole world that's inside. Oh, he saw hope to see it. He saw mind to reveal it. He saw love and feels it all the time. Woman saw the light. She found herself in the night. And she lit a fire. She took the whole world higher. Oh, she saw hope to see it. She saw mind to reveal it. She saw love and feels it all the time. Man one day learned how to fly. Woman saw the light. What they saw through their eyes, a whole world that's inside. Oh, they saw hope to see it. They saw mind to reveal it. They saw love and feel it all the time. Let it go and see what the might make you believe. What's revealed to me. Spread your wings, be free. Let it go and see what the mind made you believe. What's revealed to me. Spread your wings, be free. So that song's called Shadow, and it was written and inspired by those deep processes in our being that are contrary to the light, but they actually teach us something about ourselves that's very important and very sacred.
Wow.
Thank you. This was quite fun.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it. I hope we'll get a chance to do it again sometime.
I hope so, yeah.
All right. Well, be well, everyone.
Well, the only thing is that we like to